Every so often I get up and I say, well, we don't have slides, but it's not because I just was disorganized and didn't get the slides to Debbie on time. There's a reason for it. And just so you know, I mean it when I say it. I'm going to tell you that there are no slides because I was disorganized and didn't get them to Debbie on time. You'll see what this is for in a little bit. If you've been here in the last couple of years, you might know what to expect as the sermon topic. Along with the different national holidays we celebrate, we have a national holiday coming up tomorrow, Martin Luther King Day. That's important to me for several reasons, one of which is that Martin Luther King is the only Christian minister who's honored by our nation. And I think it's important to return to that again and again, that what he did was not social activism. What he did was preaching. He was a Baptist preacher from the South. He preached. And that's troubling to a lot of people, those who don't want to admit that preaching can create change in society, and those who don't want to admit that society needs to change when it hears some good preaching. But again and again, and also because of my own personal experience and the gifts I received from the pastors that I've known, the black pastors that I've known, who trained me and taught me so much, I come back again and again to Martin Luther King Day. But it occurred to me, sometimes you can look at this as a day where we remember what great things were done for black people. But I want to tell you something that happened this week that made me kind of illustrate why we all benefit. Why what happened, the civil rights movement, integration, all those things, why they matter to everybody. See, I went to the hospital, the Cincinnati Children's Hospital, on Wednesday because Kenzie had to be taken in for surgery. Kenzie Crutchfield, I think many of you know. We'll talk about how she's doing later. But they said that her regular surgeon, who I heard so much about how great he was, had not been able to be there, that he'd been out of town on a conference. Well, right before I left, I went downstairs and had to come back up again, and this man got on the elevator with me to go back up to the waiting room. And I noticed he had on a tie, and the tie had a little coat of arms on it. And I looked at it, and I recognized that it was the coat of arms of Harvard University, which, was kind of great. He didn't say Harvard on it, but those who knew would know. So I couldn't help. And I said, is that a Harvard tie? And he said, why, yes. And he said, did you go to Harvard? And I said, no. Now I'll tell you, I said, not quite. Now I'll tell you, the school I did go to, they printed up shirts that said if I'd wanted A's, I would have gone to Harvard. They were very proud of being the most hardcore, challenging school around. But, so I kind of sold my own school out, and I just said, well, no, I didn't go to Harvard. And then he got off on the same floor that I did. And it turned out he was their regular surgeon. That he had come, he had been at a conference, had flown back early, gotten to the airport, gotten in a car, I assume his car, I don't know, driven straight to the hospital at about 8:30, 9 at night, came in to check on Kenzie and then to talk to the family. And I gotta say, it's one thing to be a great surgeon, which obviously he is, to take the time to come back and spend that time with the family was pretty remarkable. My dad was a social worker in hospitals for most of his life. I've seen what doctors are like sometimes. And the better they are, the better they think they are. So for someone with that level of skill and expertise to have that level of compassion was really astonishing to me. And what this has to do with Martin Luther King Day is that he was black. 50 years ago, he might have been able to go to Harvard, maybe would have been able to become a doctor. Harvard was, pretty ahead of its time in a lot of ways. But it's very unlikely that he would have been allowed to become one of the leading surgeons in the country to work at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, to be given that kind of responsibility. And part of what the civil rights movement was about, part of what integration, diversity, those things are about, is making sure that the people who can do what we all need to be done have the chance to do it. That we don't simply take half the people in our country and say, not you. It's about allowing as many people as possible to share their gifts with us and with each other. That's one of the reasons why it's important for me to come back to Martin Luther King. But this year, there's actually another thing that happened on the third Sunday in January that I want to bring up. I wanted to talk about it ever since I found out about it. Because it was an event of national significance that happened 50 years ago on the third Sunday in January in 1961. And it happened in this room. Now let me ask, how many people who are here were attending Central Christian Church in 1961? Okay. Do any of you remember an event of national significance at that time? I didn't think so because it wasn't obvious, but here's what happened. The pastor at that time was Gene Brown. Reverend Brown preached a sermon that Sunday, and that wasn't particularly unusual. But his sermon was picked up and republished in the Christian Century, which is the premier magazine for basically the Protestant churches as a whole. It's a weekly, and every week they would reprint one or maybe two sermons. So out of the millions of sermons that were preached in a given year, or are preached in a given year, the Christian Century is still going, there might be a couple dozen, a few dozen, that are reprinted in this national magazine. And from there it goes out to millions of people read this then and still do. And so the sermon that Reverend Brown preached that Sunday was literally 1 in a million. I started doing some math to make sure I was right. It's not an exaggeration. The number of sermons that get that kind of national attention is about 1 in a million. And 50 years ago, on the third Sunday in January, Reverend Brown preached a 1 in a million sermon that attracted national attention. I mean, not necessarily, it wasn't on the 6 o'clock news. I'm actually not even sure if there was a 6 o'clock news in 1961, to be honest. But it didn't make the front page of any newspaper, but yet there it was. And so that's an interesting historical tidbit, but what happened when I found the actual sermon was that it speaks to 2011 every bit as clearly as it spoke to 1961. It was remarkable how relevant that sermon was, that 50 years later, it's still important. The sermon was called, "Anyone Can Go to Central Christian Church." And I want to share with you some bits of it. So the sermon begins, Reverend Brown explained that he had a meeting, a private counseling session with a young woman in Connersville. And she had all sorts of things, had all sorts of problems, had a really tough, broken life. And he says, this young woman felt she had to tell me that she had been to another church in our community. She was a member of that church. She had gone to talk to her minister. And according to what she felt, she must relate to me. Her minister had told her that anyone who had messed up her life as she had done was expecting too much of him to tolerate such conduct. According to her, he said he was too busy preaching the gospel. Then he suggested, well, why don't we go to Central Christian Church? Anybody can go there. Now he says that at first he was offended, and the comment was intended to be offensive. It was not a compliment. But he said, while it was apparently offered in an uncomplimentary fashion, it is in fact complimentary if it is true. And then Reverend Brown asked, is it really true in every sense? Does everybody or anybody who comes to Central Christian Church feel accepted, wanted, and welcome? What began as an accusation and has turned into a compliment now becomes a challenge, a not yet realized goal. And then he says in 1961, in order to be the church must be the one place where we can honestly say, I'm an alcoholic, I'm a divorcee, I killed someone I loved, I'm a gossiper, I'm a drug addict, I'm a thief, I'm a liar, but I'm here because I am in need. I didn't know they had drug addicts in 1961. Certainly, the vision of the world that's presented, there was maybe the occasional divorcee somewhere, but to be taking on these issues, which in the vision I have weren't even around, it really was pretty amazing. And certainly there's not one of those issues that isn't still with us today. So Reverend Brown issues this challenge to the church, and it's a challenge that is still ongoing. To be the place where people can honestly say, this is who I am, good and bad. And part of that challenge is for each of us who are here, including those who were here 50 years ago, to know that we can say who we truly are. That nobody has to be afraid to be the person who they are today, even knowing that God is calling us to be even closer to the person God wanted us to be. That challenge to not judge is still with us. And I think we do pretty well as churches go. But of course, the nature of a challenge is that there's never a day when you get to say, we're there. The challenge to be honest with each other and to allow everyone around us to be honest with each other, that's still part of what we struggle with. And that's good. But what Reverend Brown said next struck me even more. He said, there's one specific area for us to consider. He said, suppose you were one of the basketball players who was applauded on Friday night at the basketball game, one of the high school Spartans. Now suppose that the next week you went to a restaurant where everyone else was served and you were turned away. Or that you went to a bowling alley where your teammates were allowed in, but you were not. Wouldn't this situation be frustrating to a teenager? You are right when you think it would be more than a little frustrating. But this happened to two young people not so long ago here in Connersville. Now this really got my attention. You know I bring this up on Martin Luther King Day. They weren't excluded because they smelled bad. They were excluded because they were black. And at that time in 1961, Connersville was segregated. Not necessarily by the law, although there were some, but certainly by convention. And this was news to me, not just about Connersville, but about a lot of places. I guess I learned it by the time I got here, but the pastor I mentioned, who trained me, told a story about going to the beach with a group of his friends who were civil rights activists and being attacked by a mob, which was not stopped by the police, but actually led by the police, because they dared to step in the water at a public beach. And I said, where'd that happen? He said, oh, in Chicago. And I said, I didn't know that. And he said, oh yeah. My mom, I remember told me a story of how when she was about 5 or 6, she saw a black man for the first time. And she never told me why it was that she could go for 5 years in Detroit without ever seeing a black person. Segregation was part of not just down there in the South where the history books talk about it, but here as well. And it's not around anymore. That time, those laws, those customs were changed. Why were they changed? Well, one reason is because at least one minister talked about it. That wasn't the only sermon that Reverend Brown preached where he took on segregation. The next year, in 1962, he preached a sermon, which is he published a collection of his sermons. He published a sermon, or preached a sermon, about an incident at the city pool where some black kids had been turned away, like they always were, unless they were there with the YMCA or the YWCA were allowed to let black kids and white kids swim together in a swimming class. But outside of that, it was whites only. He preached a sermon about it, and there's a little note from the minutes that the next day at the board meeting, which, just like now, was the second Monday, somebody asked, what are we going to do about that sermon? And a group of people decided to take action. Some went to the mayor, some went to the citizens' council, and when 1963 came around, the pool wasn't segregated anymore. Change happened because of what Reverend Brown said, because of what Central Christian did. And it struck me that it's easy for a minister or a church to talk in general terms about improving things, about being better people. And nobody complains when a church talks about generalities. A church only gets into trouble when it starts talking about specifics. If you mention a specific thing that needs to be changed, a specific kind of improvement, a specific way in which we need to be better people. Because then, of course, you're actually calling for a change in the community and in the world, and maybe in people. But calling for those specifics is also what creates change. That first part of the sermon about how anybody can come to Central Christian Church left everyone smiling and nodding and thinking about whatever was comfortable for them. Going to a specific issue that was important at that point, the issue of race, that brought it to another place. And it wasn't a comfortable place, but the people who went there were able to actually change their community. And that power is still with us. The thing about Martin Luther King is that all he had to do was get up and make the truth known. The idea that everything was okay and that segregation was basically peaceful was proven to be untrue when he simply went places and mobs came after him, police dogs and water cannons. All he had to do to end segregation was bring it out into the light. So often that's true of the issues and the challenges and the sins that we face individually and together. That all we need to do about them is let them be known. That's a connection between the first and second part of Reverend Brown's sermon. He said, if we create a place where people can say who they truly are and admit their shortcomings, we can become a place where people overcome their shortcomings. That's still true. And so on this day, we remember Martin Luther King, and even this one sermon preached 50 years ago here, a sermon that led to change for Connersville. Know that you can admit who you truly are in this place with these people. And know that when we say what we still say, that anyone can come to Central Christian Church, we even mean you. If you want to be a person who comes to Central Christian Church, if you want to be a person who comes not just to church, but to Christ, then you are more than welcome to come forward and to join in fellowship with us and with the body of Christ. So please stand as we sing our invitation song.
Mankind